Okay, now we're going to do a demo on a shared service used in router communication. So component communication can use several different styles of sharing data. You can use input and output annotations, event emitters, and share between parent and children. But in the case of the router communication, you're faced with several different things. First of all, there's the life cycle of the objects which appear in the center of the page in the router outlet. They get instantiated, destroyed, instantiated, destroyed as you navigate through the router links. And so this here is going to demonstrate how you can use a shared service communicating between components on a single page application when a router link is clicked and a router component a template gets instantiated and gets rendered in the center page, and how you can use a shared service to then broadcast out information to the other components. And I'm using the simple simulated example of logging in. Okay, so first of all, let's refresh this, or let's go home. Let's refresh. And the bottom line is now we are looking at a root component which contains children, a header, a virtual center, and a footer. And the bottom line is the router outlet is on the root component, and we're rendering a home component template inside that router outlet. So basically at this point, the user is not logged in. He's looking at the home page. And basically, we have a shared service which is injected into each one of these components, and the header and the footer subscribe to notifications and wants to know when the user's logged in. And so when you click on the internal link, the internal component then broadcasts out some information that the user is logged in, and the subscribers get the information and render that in their template. Okay, so the point here is that the internal content has instantiated, and in its constructor it had this shared service, and it broadcasted out, it authenticated the user, and it broadcasted out this information after the user got authenticated that the user is logged in. And so this is a real application of how to do that using router communication and a shared service. And so we're going to take a look at the code. Notice when if I click on a log out link or a home link, I could then be logged out. And so important things to notice here is that the subscribers to the notification should definitely unsubscribe when they're destroyed. Also, the shared service can be used, if it's used at all, will be constructed, and it's a singleton instance if it's defined at the app module level. Okay, so let's take a look at the code, and let's first point out a couple things. Let me back up here. And first show you that we're using Angular 6. I created a project using Angular 6, and we have RxJS6, and we're using Node 8 here, which is just the repository which is being used. And we're running ngserve, so our serve is running, and it's waiting for changes, etc. So let's go and take a look at the application code now. Okay, so the first thing I want to point out is that, excuse me, is that we have an app module. And the app module is using the router module and the routes from Angular router. And we also have a shared service, which is imported from an ES6 module, which is shared.service. And we have a root component, app component here. I know that's the root because it's getting bootstrapped here. And I have some other components, a home component, a header component, a footer component, and there's an internal component. And I'm using all those components because I have them in my declarations. And in my import, I have a routes object where I map the paths to the component templates that need to be instantiated when I click on those router links. So I define this routes object, and then in my router module, I do a for route and define the routes for the route application. And then the last thing is I have to provide the shared service. And this is the non-shakeable shared service defined at an app module level. If that token, that shared service token, if it gets injected into any constructor and the component template does get instantiated, this token will be used to look for a class with the same name, which will get instantiated, and it will be a singleton used throughout the app module, throughout the UI component tree, so you can use it in a shared way that the components on the page will share this single instance. Okay, so let's take a look at now the root component. The root component is up here. It's under the application directory. And what I have here in the root component is I have my shared services, my shared service, which I imported. And what I do is first I have a title and I have an is logged in string, which is keeping track of my state of whether I'm logged in or not. And then and I have a title here which shows up on the top of the screen. And basically what I do is I inject the shared service. I inject the shared service into my constructor, and I use the shared service to subscribe to changes. Okay, so and I might not need this because I don't think the root component is really using any of that. As a matter of fact, let's go back. Let's just move forward for the moment. I'll come back to this service. Okay, so let's take a look at the footer, the header, the footer, and the home page. Okay, so let's look at the home page. Basically, what happens in the home page is that there is the shared service which is getting imported. It's getting injected into the constructor, and I initially defined the is logged in attribute of this object to be logged out. And then, and I even omit a change, which probably isn't necessary, just saying I'm logged out. But if we navigate back and forth, we might need that. So if you look at the header, and the footer, it's pretty much doing the same thing. Basically, what I have here is this particular method subscribes to any change emitted by the shared service. So I could log the event, but basically what I do is I put the logged in status, which is getting broadcast out. When I hit the internal component, the logged in status gets broadcast out as logged in. And what I'll do is I'll define that instance variable, and then what I'll do is render it in the template. Okay, so it gets rendered using the interpolation directive here. So the dynamic binding and the change detection, etc., works for the component. So, and notice I do have the internal component here. So let's go look at the footer component as well. The footer is the same situation. I do have a shared service injected, and upon a change admitted, I subscribe to that event. So in order to inject the service into the constructor, I have to import it up here. And so it's important that you import and inject. But the truth of the matter is that this app module, which declared this shared service token, is providing the service. So it's using the root injector to instantiate that object when a constructor injects it and the component template gets created. It's this provider which points to a token, which is by default using the shared service class name, and it's using the root injector to inject that object instance into any component in the application. So the bottom line is, all these components will use a singleton for the service. Okay, so if we look at the internal service, what you'll see is we are injecting the shared service, and this is the one that emits the change. Okay, so when you look at this particular internal component, the constructor has a private keyword here. So TypeScript says, okay, create an implicit variable called shared service. So now in this method here, I have to use the this.sharedService to actually invoke the emit change to say, oh, I'm logged in. So it emits this string to the service. And then the footer itself will get that emitted change. And it's subscribed to it already. The footer component's already instantiated, it's rendered on the page, it's subscribed to it already, and it's just waiting for that event to change. Okay, so let's go take a look at the service real quick. And this is a little bit old style because I didn't change the code really to new Angular 6. So I'm using an RxJS subject, and I have an injectable service. Which is called a shared service, which I exported. And I have a private emit change source. I instantiate a new subject of type any. It turns out this subject could probably be a string because I'm just emitting a string, really. And then what I do is I define this change emitter with the $sign. I'm not crazy about the $sign notation in Angular 6 code. I basically borrowed this example from someone on the internet, so I'm using this syntax just temporarily. I will convert this completely over to an Angular 6 and figure out what the best practice is for doing this. But I have this change emit source, which is a subject, and I could view it as an observable. So this is the thing which is part of my shared service, and by default it's public, and I could subscribe to this in any other component. The shared service instance is a singleton, and I could subscribe to this particular member because it's an observable. And then I also have emit change here method, which I can pass a change. And I could do emit change source.next. So I could keep changing the emitted event, and basically that's how I get the behavior within my application. So a subject, loosely speaking, I'm going to make this statement. A subject can be used as something that could be used to emit events and retrieve events. And if you look at the subject as an observable, you could subscribe to it. So that's why we're using a subject here. And if you you should go out and look at the documentation for the different types of subjects that are out there, because they could be used in different fashions. Okay, so this is the singleton instance, and so let's go back and look at the application again. I am home, I'm logged out, I refresh. I don't know what's taking so long. Okay, I have a root component with 3 children, header, home, and footer. Let's go and take a look at that code real quick. I have a header, a router outlet, and a footer. If you look at my routes, by default, the home component will be shown in the router outlet. When I click on internal, this router link, this object gets removed and a new one gets instantiated. When this one gets instantiated, when it gets initialized, it emits an event called logged in. This component header has subscribed to that. This footer has subscribed to that. And the internal component updates its state to signify that it's logged in. So just a heads up and a warning, when you're clicking on these links and the objects are getting instantiated and created or destroyed, etc., then basically you got to be careful, because there is some synchronization issue here. Just be careful when you emit and when you subscribe, etc., and make sure that it all works. Now, if we weren't using a router, let me point that out. If we weren't using a router and I hit this page and I was logged out, and I hit this page and I was not logged in, let's say, the root component can share with its children header, home, and footer. The home component can broadcast up to the root component, which can then send data down to the header component. So things get a little bit complicated with communication when you're looking at a UI component tree, which is very complicated. So this simplifies things a little bit, but it's not always the best scenario. So just keep that in mind. And so that's really all I wanted to show you for the demo. And I guess a couple of other things I should point out. I did subscribe here. And I did not unsubscribe. And so you should always unsubscribe in your components. So let's see, and also anything, let's see if I could just change this really quick. Let's see, the home component, what it did was it logged out. Let me see if I just remove this, what would happen. Okay, so now when I click on internal, I broadcast out the message. Home, internal. And of course, if you're over here, you could put the username as logged in and put my picture up on the screen. And over here, you could remove that and put the login link up here. And of course, I've done that. I've done that myself. So that's really all I wanted to show for the demo.